Great. So thank you everybody for coming along. Welcome to the Postgrad and ECR TASA Thursday on Autoethnography. It is great to have you all along with us. Just a quick note, we are recording the session today. So if you want to have your face on, that's great. If you want to hide behind the little black screen or a picture, that's fine too. So today we have a special guest, Dr. Ash Watson, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I'm sitting on the land of the Ghana people, and I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. So also, before I forget, I should say this at the start as well, if you are a postgrad TASA member and you are enjoying sessions like this and you want to get involved in the postgrad subcommittee, there is a current expression of interest out. So if you enjoy representing postgrads to TASA or running events, then yeah, please join on that and put an expression of interest in, that'd be great. All right. So Ash, just a little bit of her. Ash is a postdoctoral fellow at the Vitalities Lab at UNSW Sydney. Her research focuses on digital technologies and personal data, as well as DIY practices like community archiving and zine making. She is also the creator of the Public Sociology Project for SoFi Zine and the outgoing secretary of TASA. She was also previously the postgraduate subcommittee portfolio leader as well. So, oh dear, I'm very sorry.
That's okay. I thought it was me.
No. Where did I get up to before that crashed out? Does anybody have? Did I introduce you, Ash? Before?
Yes, you did. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, in that case, I'm just going to hand over to you. Can you tell us a little bit about your ethnographic experience?
Yeah, sure. So, I guess I'm hoping that today will mostly be a discussion between everybody. So I'm really keen to hear what projects people are working on. Even if you wanted to just share that in the chat, if not on video and audio, please feel free to just jump in and join the conversation. I used autoethnography in my PhD project, along with a couple of other methods. So I combined 3 methods in my research. And yeah, I think it's a great method for lots of different kinds of projects that you could be doing. In my project, I was focused on, it was mostly focused around the idea of public sociology and looking at different ways that we can draw on creative practices and the arts to kind of better engage various publics with sociological ideas and the results of our research, as well as in sociological imagination. So a lot of what I used autoethnography for was to, I suppose, think about the application of Mills's famous idea of the sociological imagination and how well it can apply to contemporary Australian society and perhaps what the limitations are of that. And so autoethnography was one of 3 methods that I used, and it was quite a nice method for this project because it helped me really dive into certain parts of Mills's ideas around what it means to be a biographical entity. And I know that applies in, that kind of idea applies in lots of different areas that you might be doing sociological research around. So it's a, yeah, it's a great method for kind of not just centering your personal experience, but your expertise as an individual within a certain field or a certain issue, or yeah, kind of bringing together that that intersection between sociological knowledge and theory and the understandings that we gain of the world from research with all those critically important personal experiences that we have. So maybe to kick off, I'd love to hear about some of the projects that people are doing, and then we might talk a bit about I suppose some of the practical things about doing autoethnography as a method, some of the different approaches that you can take in doing it, and some other important parts like ethical considerations, of course, always a big thing in ethnographic approaches.
Great, yeah, anyone can jump in and tell us about a project that they're working on or thinking about as well. That would be really interesting.
Hi, Anne.
Go for it.
Hi, Ash. How you going?
Good.
Hi everyone, I'm Anne, and I have been using critical autoethnography for a number of reasons, but one is that I'm an unemployed bum now and I want to be an active researcher, and I lost my job as a result of the pandemic, so I've been unemployed for 7 months. But I've also been, while working in universities, I was working as a casual academic, and as you know, that's a very vulnerable and precarious career path to hold. And so I was using critical ethnography prior to that, largely as a result of that very tenuous status within the academy. So I've already done a couple of publications using critical autoethnography, and one was an examination of experiences of racism in Australia, and I linked it to using one drop of race as an example of creating a hegemonic status in Australia, and I looked at hair. So I had it published in a special issue on hair textures in a journal called Africology. Since then, I've continued to work with critical autoethnography, and it allows me to do a number of things, given that I work outside of a institution and work as an independent scholar. In particular, for me, it poses issues about how do you research and act ethically while outside of any sort of institutional authority, because while there's no oversight, there still is a necessity to think and act and breathe ethically. So I've turned to it for a number of reasons: employment, institutional authority over ethics, how to take up and maintain an ethical position as a researcher, because I want to, when you're outside of that authority of an institution. Maybe I'll stop there and let others talk.
Thanks so much, Anne. Yeah, that's a really important point that I definitely want to talk more about today, the different facets of ethics with regards to autoethnography, as well as the kind of practical things of needing to needing to have ethical approval from your university to do your projects, as well as the, what it means to do research in this way ethically. So, difference between the kind of the processes and the ongoing process of doing ethical research. Yeah, I'd love to talk about that more. Can we hear about some other projects as well?
I'm happy to share very briefly.
Thanks.
Sorry, I missed the introduction. I'm really interested in just jumping into this because autoethnography is not something I've necessarily considered early in my research piece. I'm a PhD candidate about halfway through. But during the COVID period, one of my supervisors suggested maybe autoethnography was an option for me. And again, I kind of dismissed it until very recently. I've been confronting a lot of effect and a lot of my own kind of stuff in terms of processing the transcriptions and the interview data that I've come up with through researching a different group of people that I had anticipated due to COVID. So it's very, very challenging, the content that these people have shared with me, and my initial reactions to them are quite also challenging. So a few different people have said, you need to record this, you need to do autoethnography of it, and I'm not really quite sure what that all entails. So I'm really interested in actually kind of getting a feel for what else is around and a little bit more about the process in itself.
Nice, thanks, Linda. Yeah, it's I think that's probably good advice for if only to kind of whether you take up autoethnography as a formal method at this point in the project or not, kind of capturing those reflexive insights can really add a lot of value to learning the research process while doing a PhD, I think, and reflecting on, I suppose, both how your experience of dealing with data like this, as well as trying to get some insight into the ways that you process it and the ways that you start to analyze it, and all of those kind of those kinds of things that almost sit outside the neat I've transcribed it, and now I'll do this coding and I'll apply these frameworks. And there's a lot that happens between those spaces that are really important for, that can add real value to the thesis itself, but also for developing our skills as researchers. So yeah, I think definitely a good idea to record it, and hopefully our talk today can give you some more insight into whether you do want to take it up as a formal method at this point. Thanks so much. A couple in the chat. Oh, that's okay, no worries. If you're in a shared office, using autoethnography in a new project around. Yeah, please do, please jump in.
Oh yeah, thank you. I'm still very early in the early stage of my PhD, looking at migration and HIV, and then because my positioning is sort of also like as an insider researcher with the participants as well. One of the things that I sort of realized in the early stage of my PhD was that I have had this sort of diary, like a journal thing that I've been doing for a couple of years that sort of captures my life and in a way also my migration journey. But I'm not particularly sure as to like what methodology that can be utilized to analyze these sort of readily available data to do it. And I was kind of like thinking about autoethnography as one, and also other diary-based methods as well. So I just want to know, I guess, the differences between those methods.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing. That's a really common thing, I think, is when keeping a research journal anyway, where does it where can it become autoethnography as a method itself? And then how can we use those things that perhaps we might have started not as an autoethnography, but then we move into that as a formal method. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think I have lots of reflections on using a research diary and the kind of diary related parts of doing autoethnography and how they kind of sit between each other, and whether you have a formal way of recording your autoethnographic insights as you move through a project, as well as then how might you use that in a thesis itself. So does anybody else want to share their projects, and then we might start to talk about some of the questions raised so far? Yeah, Giselle.
Yeah, I'll just share quickly. Hi, my name's Giselle. My research is on donor conception, and I was donor conceived myself. So there's a kind of element of insider research. Yeah, I've kind of like some of the comments in the chat, written a little bit about positionality and in a kind of reflexive way, but obviously not a more formal autoethnography. And in terms of ethics, I guess I often think about how when something's out there, it later on as my ideas or my opinions evolve on the issue, the kind of risk of putting it out there and it being out there, something that's so personal, being out there, and the risk of those opinions changing over time. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough question. It's a hard thing to navigate, especially when we do research that is so personal to us, and recognizing that perhaps our experiences and what we think about things might change over time. There's no easy answer to questions like that. It's kind of a process of making sense of it as you go through the project. Well, I guess there's lots of questions that people have raised so far around the kind of a method process itself, as well as ethics and positionality, as people are also talking in the chat, I can see. And I think this question of reflexivity is a really important one, because there's not kind of an expectation that it's something that we just have to do because of it's expected of us. But I think it's a really valuable part of contemporary research that reflexivity is an expected part of what we do as researchers and how we approach our methods as well as our analysis. And I think this is valuable not like as a step in the process of doing a PhD, but because for me, reflexivity is a really important part of critical thinking itself. So it's important with any research that we do, whether it's kind of definitively autoethnographic or it's kind of just another kind of a lens that we bring to bear in writing a thesis, that kind of personal experience or our commitments to a project. And not just as a concept that we might engage with in our analysis, but something that we kind of a way of using our methods to research the social world, that it's kind of almost something we can bake into our style of research, which I think is really important. And I suppose that growing valuing of reflexivity is perhaps why autoethnography has become kind of such a significant part of contemporary qualitative research, or is definitely kind of growing in recognition. Even I noticed from what, like 6 or 7 years ago, starting my PhD to now, there's a lot more writing on it. There's a lot more literature out there on the kind of nuances of an autoethnographic approach. The question of reflexivity in writing is something that I feel like everybody will probably need to engage with in their thesis, no matter what methods that they're using. But if you are interested in using autoethnography itself, or a kind of ethnographic approach where your personal experience in that is really important, I think it's useful to not just understand that recent theory and writing on autoethnography, but the kind of wider landscape that this very contemporary approach sits within. So actually there's a lot of really useful discussion on reflexivity in the kind of long history of writing on ethnography and on autobiographical or biographical and narrative-based methods. Because between these two fields is really where autoethnography today sits. So having a strong understanding of that that kind of terrain of research approach, I think is really useful. So if you're interested in autoethnography, or you're kind of even grappling with these broader ideas around reflexivity, I think that's a great place to start. And I definitely found that very useful when I was at the point of my PhD of trying to decide what methods best suited my research questions and what kind of style was I going to use in using those methods. So yeah, I definitely, if you're interested in this approach, or you have these kinds of questions, don't just start, I think, with the literature that's explicitly on reflexivity or is explicitly talking about autoethnography. I think it's a great idea to try and get a really broad understanding of the social research landscape. So read across ethnography, especially around that blurry border between sociology and anthropology. There's a lot of great discussions in that history, but also around narrative methods as well. Because it's not also just about the way that we engage with the social world, but the way that we then record that social world. The writing of it is really important, and the storying of it is really important. And I think that's something that kind of narrative methods really get at really nicely. I might just have a look what's in the chat. Does anybody have another project that they wanted to share? Or Ben, did you have any?
I just thought I'd ask a question as a follow-up to what you were just describing, because what you said makes a lot of sense, and a really great breakdown of the different literature that exists in some of the different spaces. I'm wondering if, building on that, if there are practices, like what do you do to bring some of that to life? Are there things that you can practically do to foster your own reflexivity, so that not just sitting in front of a keyboard and typing away, but like what else do you do?
Yeah, a very good question. I think there's lots of different things that we can do. Yeah, and like I said, I think this is really strong, not just as something that we kind of nod to when we're writing the thesis, or we're doing our analysis, and it's like, well, we probably need to not like reflect on this. Reflexivity is much more than just kind of reflecting on your practice. It's bringing a kind of like critically reflective sensibility through the process of doing research. So I think keeping a research journal is one really useful way that I have personally found for I suppose making myself actually do that work of critical reflection and not just in a way that it's in my head and I'm trying to like ethically engage with the world while doing research, but that I kind of sit down and I have a dedicated writing practice of writing in my research journal. And in that I kind of am both reflecting on the research that I'm doing, and I'm also engaging with the literature around reflexivity and kind of writing my way through thinking about how the things that other people have written about reflexivity, kind of how I feel about them, how they kind of are brought to bear on my research field. This is probably different for a lot of people, but for me, writing is really at the heart of all of my research practice. And it's actually, funnily, when I'm doing this kind of research journaling work, I really prefer to write by hand. I feel like it slows down the process for me a bit. And I'm not just kind of typing in a way that I'm also worried about kind of how it looks in my formatting and like this has to fit in a thesis chapter somewhere. But writing it by hand, I find really useful, and it's kind of personal and it feels kind of contained in a way that it's not going to go anywhere. It kind of frees me up to I suppose be more vulnerable with actually putting into words some of the difficulties I'm having in bringing together thinking and yeah, kind of giving myself the space to do that kind of reflective critical thinking type work. I know there are a few different writing exercises that can be useful for this as a practical activity. I think from memory, most of the ones I found useful though weren't necessarily around reflexivity themselves, but were actually around the style of autoethnography. So around kind of techniques for writing an evocative autoethnography versus writing an analytic autoethnography. Because even though these are kind of just slightly separate approaches to the same method, they unearth reflexive thinking in different ways. So I think, yeah, perhaps it's something that I didn't necessarily sit down and go, right, well, I'm gonna be reflexive now. I'm gonna handwrite it. I'm gonna think reflexively, and it's gonna now be a reflexive project. It was something that's kind of that's embedded within other parts of doing that autoethnographic writing. And so it's something to be aware of, but it's also not something that you can easily kind of sit down and be like, right, if I answer these set questions, then I will be having kind of an adequately reflexive approach in my project. Yeah, so it might be more of for a practical technique, I think it's probably more of a thing to test different ways of doing ethnographic writing itself, rather than necessarily focusing specifically on the question of reflexivity. Does anybody have any other techniques? I'd be really interested to hear what other people have been trying.
Hi, I'm Alexa. I know Ash and Anne. I've met a few of you before. I was actually listening in on the way home, but I was with 2 children and a million bags, so I didn't want to try and attempt to share my project while trying to do that, navigating home with so much baggage. I've actually found autoethnography an incredibly rewarding process this year. I completed my PhD in May. I was conferred in May. But I really felt the need after completing my PhD to write about the process of doing the PhD, my own personal experience. And part of the reason for that is the fact that my father died towards the end of that process while I was overseas. And I didn't share that actually with supervisors or peers. I kept it a secret. And so I grieved in silence while I wrote up my thesis while pregnant and gave birth and kept writing. So it was quite a challenging emotional process. And I think after writing the thesis and thinking, wow, I've made it and I've finished, I really wanted to write about the process of doing a doctorate while grieving. I didn't find any work. I found 2 pieces on grief and doing a PhD, but one of them was about the loss of a son, and the other one was about a loss of a partnership, but he still spoke very much about grief. But I really felt the need to write about the loss of a parent who was very invested in my work and who didn't get to see the outcome of that. and how I kind of came to terms with it. So that piece has been written and it's currently under review by the Journal of Autoethnography, which is quite a new journal, but I really love it. I don't know if anyone else is looking at it, but it's just beautiful. That's my project that I've worked on this year. And although it's meant that I've kind of been held back in terms of publishing from my thesis, I just felt that was a necessary step I needed to make before actually moving back to my thesis and starting to, return to that writing. So I'm so glad to be part of this group of people who are excited about autoethnography, because I really love it as a style. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Alexa. It sounds like actually a really important and powerful piece of work, and I look forward to reading it. That's I got an incredibly challenging experience, but I imagine quite cathartic to write it out and I guess kind of grapple with that experience through writing.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks for.
Thanks so much, Alexa. It's kind of, I think grappling with our experiences of things through writing is literally the point of this entire process and why you take up a method like this. I can see people in the chat as well talking about how they've been advised to take up autoethnography, and as we've talked about, the kind of the reflexive writing that you might do while doing a research project. I guess what we're talking about today is a few different things there, the different kinds of writing that you might do that might be useful within a project, useful for making sense of the research that you're doing, and then also whether you might take it up as a formal method. So should we talk across those few things? Because even though a lot of the other discussions that we're having are useful across all of them, I think there are perhaps some different things to consider if you are taking up as like a formal method of your PhD, and you'll like have a methods chapter on it, and you might need to apply for ethical approval through your university. There is other certain things to think about in terms of process that won't necessarily apply to the other kinds of writing that we're talking about. So okay, cool. Great. So I guess some of the practical things to think about if you want to take up autoethnography is, first of all, deciding whether it is a method that will answer one of your research questions, just like any other method, because there is a lot of value that you can get in the thesis as a finished product itself and in the process of doing any research project that you will get from keeping a research journal and doing ethnographic kind of writing in that. I think there is a distinction in kind of what it means for your thesis and what it means for your like formal methods, if you want to take it up as a method and not just kind of not doing it on the side. I guess I'm trying to separate them out only as a matter of process in terms of what you need to do for it to be a formal method. So the first thing, of course, with any method is to decide whether it's a method that will actually answer your research question. So whether it is important and significant to gather that data on your personal experience. And if you are doing it as a formal method, there are things to think about that also apply for other ethnographic methods, about kind of who else are the participants in this project. Because even when we keep autoethnographic diaries, we are never just writing about ourselves in a vacuum. There are always other people implicated in what we're writing about. We always end up writing about our relationships with other people and our experiences in social worlds. So it will, I mean, different universities have different requirements for submitting for ethical approval. And so you need to kind of be across what's expected of you at your institution if you when you're applying for ethics approval for your PhD project. So where I did my PhD, for example, they had a series of human ethics booklets online that spelled out for every method what would be required of you. And it was kind of like a a series of questions, and you answer yes or no to the questions, and then it directs you to the next page, and you can read more about it, and you kind of get more and more into detail into specifically what will be required of you and not required of you, depending on the exact approach that you want to take, depending on the field of research that you're writing about as well. So these booklets were university specific. So even though we have like a national framework for human research ethics, there are also university specific things that you'll need to be across. So that's a really important starting point for everybody, to have a look at what's required at your institution. Your supervisors should be across this stuff. It will also be really useful to, there's usually a university webpage. You might need to log into it to find out the resources, but usually there are resources online, or contact people that you can just talk to get further information. Also reach out to your peers in your PhD cohort who have already been through the ethics process recently. Because sometimes like the forms that you need to fill in can change every now and then. So yeah, to try and get really up-to-date advice on what you need to prepare to put that in. Sometimes your peers are the people who have most recently put ethics in for a similar kind of project. So yeah, ask around, ask for help from other people who are doing similar things. Check out what resources are available on your own on your own university's websites, because it will be university specific what kind of forms you need to fill in to get approval for a project. So from my experience, when I did my PhD, I used autoethnography as part of 3 methods, but also one of those methods was an arts-based research method. So as part of my thesis, I wrote a novel, and I was using the arts-based method of fiction writing. And all of the autoethnography I did, so autoethnography was a formal method of my project. I kept kind of a series of research journals, and I had a kind of and I had a set method of writing those. I would have a structure around them. I had different phases and kind of different things that I'd use them for, and I'd take certain kinds of notes in different kinds of ways that I kind of all set out at the beginning, just like any research method that you would. But because those autoethnographic notes were informing the novel, and they wouldn't exist anywhere else other than kind of being fictionalized in the book, I didn't require ethics approval to do that autoethnography, but I did need a formal email from my ethics committee saying you do not need to apply for formal approval for this. So you need to like get approval to not have approval as well. I don't recommend just kind of going ahead and trusting that you don't need it based on other people's experiences. I think it's always good to at least have that formal notification that no, you might not need to get ethics approval for this. But the technicality that based on was, where will these notes end up? So even though I discussed them in my thesis, and I included the kind of detailed analysis of the notes in my thesis, I didn't transcribe them verbatim in the thesis. And I had to ensure that nobody could be identifiable from them and the kind of details that I did include. And I couldn't include the notes themselves in the work. So there are some kind of technical things that that can depend on, which are actually more about where they will go rather than the process of writing and collecting that autoethnographic data itself. So I am sure though that those slight technicalities could be different at different universities. So definitely do check what is required at your institution, and and ask around. And a lot of those decisions are based around broader ethnography ethics. So even though it's kind of an autoethnography and that personal experience is really centered in it, and it's kind of about you and your experience and your expertise in your life, it's it's a model that's based on ethnography where you're not necessarily just writing about yourself, which I think is important, because when we are doing this, we, as I said, are rarely, never, I think, writing just about ourselves. I feel like I just rambled for a long time, but hopefully that was somewhat useful.
That was great. Thank you.
Cool.
That's great. Yeah, I think the ethics process is something worth examining in detail, like you have. So that's been really helpful.
Mm.
Is there another bit you would like to move on to, or would you like me to raise a couple of the other questions that have been posted so far?
Yeah, maybe let's have a look at some of the other questions, because as I said, some of the other things that we've raised so far will cut across whether you're using it as a formal method or whether you it's kind of something that supplements the overall research process itself. So well, I suppose first, does anybody have any questions specifically about, say, starting this as a formal method for your PhD, either around ethics or around process or around readings, before we might talk across kind of like reflexive writing and situated knowledge and that kind of stuff more broadly?
I just have like a quick questions, and this might sound weird, but like, particularly for an insider researcher, in what ways that you probably have to consider that probably autoethnography is not a good method to use, whether it formally or otherwise, but like that maybe, you know, just doing it kind of like just regular research projects probably the best. So in what way that you would know that, yeah, probably that's not a good way to do, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I suppose figuring out whether it's a useful method, for me, it's actually a very similar process to deciding whether any method or any kind of style of applying a method works for a research project. So at that very basic level, I think it can be useful to approach autoethnography as any kind of social research method. So really spend some time nailing down what are your research questions, what is it that you're interested in finding out, and it's not an easy thing to kind of to nail down the right wording of a research question, but it does take time. So yeah, figuring out whether those methods can answer those questions is something that you kind of need to spend time with mapping, and it really comes back to what are you interested in finding out? What are you kind of what kind of data will answer the questions that you're asking? Yeah, so like any research method, I think it's important to come back to those basic questions. Of course, I think the most valuable that autoethnography can be in answering research questions is when we understand it as a method where you're not just centering your personal experience, because in almost any research that we do, I've been talking to I've been doing this other course with a heap of STEM people this week who actually their kind of personal experience is really important in why they do the research that they do. And they center that when they talk to people. I mean, they might not kind of have these long discussions of reflexivity in kind of mathematical modeling when they're writing their journal articles, but that personal experience is really valuable across the board. So I think the decision around whether it's the right method for you comes down to not just that level of personal experience, but understanding and wanting to research the individual expertise you have in a field. So what you're really doing in autoethnography is you're placing yourself and really exploring how you are the vector between a social world and a way of researching and theorizing that world. So it kind of, I feel like it's just that half step more than centering personal experience, and that's when it's important, because personal experience can always be important and relevant and valuable in our research. I think that's what good reflexive research acknowledges, and not just social research either. Research across the board acknowledges that. And yeah, when it would be a useful question depends on that individual expertise you have in a social world and in a field. And when that is something significant to bring to bear, then I think that's when you can really embrace autoethnography as an important method. This might be my personal preference, but I think autoethnography is the strongest when it's paired with other methods. So it's used in multiple or mixed methods research projects. Although saying that, there are heaps of great autoethnographic projects that just use autoethnography. But yeah, my real interest and where I really think that it shines is when it's used to kind of complement and extend other social research methods as well. hopefully that answers your question. It's it can be a hard thing to figure out, especially at the start of a research project. And even if you're just doing autoethnography, that insider outsider boundary is an incredibly blurry one, and a lot of the ethnography that I like kind of does away with that boundary, and it recognizes that actually it depends on what is happening in the field that you're researching. It depends on what's happening in the field, whether you're kind of drawing more on your observations as an outsider, or you're really leaning into the observations that you gain as an insider. There's actually a lot of great PhD theses out there by people that I read while doing mine. I can't remember where they were though. Maybe I'll find them and I can email them to you, Ben. Around people who kind of start a project as an insider ethnographer, and by the end, kind of go through this like unraveling experience of kind of thinking, well, perhaps I am an outsider in this field, and actually through the process of research, rather than feeling like they've come to be an even greater insider in something, feel like they've kind of pulled themselves out of it. So it is a blurry boundary, and people definitely acknowledge that. And when I write about autoethnography, I usually write auto/ethnography, because for me it is a really fluid thing. And I am through the process of doing my PhD, I kind of did my autoethnography in 3 phases, and by the end, I was really writing less and less about myself, because I really wrote heavily about myself and kind of my feelings and my experiences, and took that really evocative autoethnographic approach in the first kind of, say, 1.5 phases. And then I shifted more to an analytic approach towards the end of it. Part of that was because I was kind of really sinking my teeth into some theory, and I was grappling with how those early observations kind of came together with the theorizing that I was doing. And analytic autoethnographic techniques gave me a method to bring those together in my writing and really capture the experience of doing that analyzing work myself, rather than kind of just coming out with the polished like end analysis as it's written up. So it depends. The insider outsider positioning, perhaps you kind of always have one foot in both camps, and it depends, just which one you're putting emphasis on depends what's kind of happening in the field and what's significant at a given time. So it's something to it's not something I think to decide at the start of a project that this is what my positioning is. I think that's the difference again between like acknowledging your position and kind of wrestling with this idea of positionality. It's more fluid and it's unfolding and it changes over time. A PhD project is something that you do over a number of years, and it, your understanding will change, your feelings will change, your position within a field and your personal experience will change. The kind of expertise that you kind of bring to bear on that field will definitely change over that time. So not just being open to that process, but I think that's a valuable process to capture. So I think tuning into that process and really relishing it and drawing it out of the processes, I think, it can be super, super valuable and add a lot to the research that you're doing.
Ash, I just thought I'd flag quickly as well, and if there's space in the conversation today, just because we're getting towards the end of the time we have, that in our Twitter poll for this session, digital autoethnography was a popular point of conversation as well. So I don't know if you want to speak to that now or later, but I just thought I'd throw that in there as well. Yeah,
sure. I actually read a paper this morning after your email, Ben, about the question of digital autoethnography, where some people are arguing that all contemporary autoethnography is digital ethnography, that it's we live in such kind of digitally embedded worlds that it's hard to delineate between doing a non-digital autoethnography to a digital autoethnography. So I suppose it for me, with a digitally focused project, a lot of the same questions exist around doing ethnographic approaches to researching the social world. often I find that when we're researching digital phenomena and we're doing digital research, we're asking the same kinds of questions that we do in any other sociological field. We're still focused on relationships between people. We're focused on kind of the interactions between people and things, and the way that things mediate our relationships, and the kind of the multiplicity and the multi-directional power of those things in those relationships. So yeah, I think it's the digital is something important to consider, I think, in any kind of research that you might be doing across the ethnographic spectrum, because yeah, we do live in such digitally embedded worlds, and great writing about the internet, like digital ethnography so often still draws on those personal narratives and those personal experiences with a platform, because it acknowledges the position of the researcher in the field is necessarily kind of one that's me sitting on the other side of a screen to somebody else. So I think, yeah, I kind of like that idea that contemporary autoethnography is digital ethnography. Are there any kind of other more, I don't know, like process experiences or methods questions that people have around what might be different with the digital space?
It makes me think of, you know, are there different ethical questions in that space, rather compared to or analog autoethnography, for lack of a better word. Yeah, so there are different ethical questions we should consider.
Yeah, that's a great point. The Association of Internet Researchers has a great ethical kind of guidelines or framework for people who are interested. Theirs is focused on kind of if you're kind of doing like an ethnography of like a Facebook group, for instance, and it kind of dealing with strangers and anonymity in these different ways, kind of just because something's on the internet doesn't mean that it's free reign for us to treat as data in our research. And I think AIR has some of the best some of the best writing and some of the best questions and some of the best frameworks for doing ethical research online. Yeah, as you said, Ben, that when some of those additional questions are raised because of the different digital platforms that we might engage with. So yeah, if you're doing digital ethnography or autoethnography, definitely check out it's the Association of Internet Researchers. They have lots of resources on ethics.
Great, I'll put a link to that. I've just been looking it up, and I think Anne had her hand up.
Hi, sorry. I'm trying to both mute and unmute at the same time. No, Ash has raised the point I was going to raise, which is about the issues of consent in autoethnography. You know, we don't live on a planet by ourselves. We live in a set of relationships with other people, and we need to be, I think, at least mindful and sensitive to the idea that other people don't want their intersecting stories with the autoethnography told. So there's we could talk about that for ages, but I just wanted to raise that issue that it does pose unique issues about what is consent and how do we act ethically, especially if you're writing about your family or if you're writing about a set of relationships. That issue of consent, we have to think it through very carefully. There's a lot of very emotionally and psychologically sensitive stuff that we walk on very tenuous territory, I think, when we do this work. And it's one of the issues I've had to face as an independent scholar is where do I get who do I share that reflexive pondering with while doing that research, especially when you're outside the academy, because you no longer have access to colleagues or to I think I've said in the past, I get terribly jealous of people who've got access to a good computer, but you also no longer have access to casual conversations, to corridor conversations. You no longer have access to a whole community of scholars because literally you stop existing for them when you leave the academy. So who do you talk to? And I think we need to, for those of us who are outside the academy, is to develop a network. And TASA has been that network for me this year as I've developed friendships through Zoom. So yeah, just put that out there that we have to find ways to address it, and that's a really important part of the research.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's yeah, as I said at the beginning, and as you've raised again, there's definitely, I think, a distinction between the way that we think of ethics in putting together, you know, our documents for getting ethics approval for our project, and the kinds of discussions that we have about an ethical approach to doing research. There's some great discussions, especially around autoethnography, on kind of the politics of ethics and the idea of ethics as friendship. Which there's some really useful books around those ideas, which would be useful for people to read if you're interested in these questions. Yeah, and as I said, and kind of having the networks to have these discussions is also really, really important. Yeah, especially I think as like early academics and at early points in our career. Yeah, I mean, these are hard things and hard questions to address, and difficult things to figure out, and things that really we only can figure out in communities of practice, and kind of by having discussions like this and sharing knowledge and sharing skills and resources. Yeah, I suppose just like the practice of keeping a research journal and doing reflexive writing, whether that's formally as autoethnography or not, is super valuable, I have found, and I know a lot of other people find, for doing that work and getting into that, kind of getting into that process yourself. It's equally as important to be able to have these conversations with other people. I know a lot of those conversations do happen in the literature, so there's heaps of good writing and good kind of pieces that sit in conversation with each other in the autoethnographic community. That kind of, that's one medium that some of these conversations are carried out. Of course, obviously, you know, that kind of being part of that often requires you to have a piece published, and you know, there are all kinds of yeah, it's just one medium, I suppose, for those conversations to happen. But things like this are definitely another one. Interestingly, some of the greatest work I found in autoethnography is in like sports and tourism journals. I don't know, something I think about kind of like people who play sports professionally coming to be critical sports researchers have this really great understanding of like the importance of embodiment, and then are really great writers. There's some really great discussions that happen in those journals, actually, even if the topic is like totally not relevant to what you're doing. These kind of can be great, great places to look at the different ways that people make sense of how they marry their methods with their theoretical and conceptual understandings. I know that was something that Annie raised earlier, and it's yeah, I think that's another thing. When I said before about kind of really reading across the landscape of social research to understand why ethnography sits where it does, both as a practice, in like kind of the practical things that it does as a method, but also the politics of the method. That landscape definitely includes theory. So understanding that generative relationship between methods and theory is super important for any approach that you'll use in your research. So yeah, there are different, a lot of these different styles of autoethnography happen because people have kind of come from different conceptual underpinnings or take a different theoretical lens, and that has impacts literally for the way that we do the research in the first place. So reading across that landscape of you know, ethnography and anthropology and narrative methods definitely also means engaging with the different theoretical bases and the different conceptual underpinnings that will be important for you when when doing the work.
We're getting very close to the end of our time. Would you like to take one more question? Have we got time for one more, do you think? Or should we?
Yeah, if anybody has a short one.
I'll ask a question. I guess I've sort of engaged with this process very independently, but is anyone sort of involved in a community of autoethnographers? And if you are, in what way sort of have you thought about doing, say, collective autoethnography? Is that something anyone has explored? I have read pieces which are really powerful, where people have come together and shared their autoethnographic musings. But yeah, I'm just keen to hear if anyone in this group is involved in sort of a community of autoethnographers, perhaps Australia-based or internationally.
Hi, very quickly. I know we don't have much time. Yes, I've tried twice, and twice it's failed, as co-authors found it very difficult to step forward and actually produce in the space. So I have tried it, and I must say that I think fail is the word, but we needed to put the project aside. It just didn't work. Autoethnography can be incredibly confronting, as you know, Alexa, from your own experience. And thank you for telling us about it. I'd love to catch up by email later.
Yeah,
I'm now trying another one with some Indigenous authors, and we're calling it Wonderful People We Have Met. But again, yeah, isn't it great? Yeah. And I've been thinking about just setting up a blog space where people can just contribute stories, but it had also struck me that that's could be both a very exciting project, but also very risky, because, as Gazella said, there's an enormous emotional risk, but also a political risk in putting your work out there in the public space, in the digital world like that. So yes, I have tried it. Unfortunately, every time it's failed, and at the moment I'm flirting with another one, a collective or community of autoethnography.
Yeah, it's quite challenging as a collective process. It yeah, and being called autoethnography, it almost seems against that kind of collective writing practice. Yes, some people do it well, so it might be a matter of kind of I don't know, like meeting with people who are also interested in and trying to model it after the process that people who do write together talk about in their publications. I just shared a group in the chat, which is a Facebook group if you have Facebook. Otherwise, they're called the Internet Association for Autoethnography and Narrative Inquiry. This was a group that I connected with during my PhD, and actually managed to go to one of the conferences that they had in the UK early on in my thesis, and they had a it was such a great event. It was the weirdest conference that I've ever been to, because it was so anti-conference. People kind of, instead of giving a paper, like sang a song, or we kind of just sat in a group of chairs for the day and actually had really rich and meaty discussions about what it means to do research in that way. And people kind of did present papers, but in very in very conversational ways. That was more about kind of, I'm the person that's going to start the conversation about something that I'm working on it or having trouble with, and it was great. So they are it's a very great group. There are lots of them around. I'm sure, as we've been doing in Australia, other people are I mean, one is slight glimmer of an upside to the year that we're having is the ability to connect with scholars overseas, because online events are happening much more than they ever have before. So there's always been a real limitation for Australian scholars trying to connect with people overseas and forge those networks. So I definitely encourage you to reach out to groups like this and find them. Lots of people do just exist in Facebook groups, or they have like one website landing page and they run events on Zoom and things like that. So definitely there are people out there who also are asking these kinds of questions and have great experience and really want to connect. So I definitely encourage you to do so.
Well, that upside of 2020 seems like a really appropriate place to stop the conversation.
Let's go back to watching the election.
Yeah, if you want to do that, maybe actually write some autoethnography about that as well. That would be fascinating. But thank you very much, Ash. A massive round of applause, and thank you for coming and facilitating this conversation and sharing a lot of your experience. Thank you to everybody who shared as well, particularly in the chat. I just got a message before from Sally, who's from TASA, saying this is the most active chat she's seen in any of the TASA Thursdays. So round of applause to all of you for doing that. That's really cool. As I said, this has been recorded, so we'll pop it up, and I'll probably try and share all the links and resources that people shared as well in that recording, and we'll tweet it out. So thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.